Petty Officer First Class Takeshi Yamamoto was 22 years old when he woke up on April 7, 1945. He'd been sleeping in the forward crew quarters of the Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, a vessel so massive and so heavily armored that Japanese sailors had long ago stopped being afraid of it. The Yamato was unsinkable. That's what they'd been told. That's what they believed. That's what every sailor aboard the ship knew with absolute certainty. By nightfall on April 7th, that certainty would be obliterated. Takeshi had been serving on the Yamato for 3 years. He was a gun captain on one of the secondary battery turrets, a position that required technical skill and intimate knowledge of the ship's systems. He'd been through air attacks before. He'd experienced American air raids. He'd seen what American aircraft could do, but he'd always been confident that the Yamato could take it. The armor was too thick, the anti-aircraft defenses were too comprehensive, the ship was too valuable for the Japanese Navy to allow it to be seriously damaged. On the morning of April 7th, as Takeshi went to his battle station, he had no sense that this day would be different from dozens of other days when the ship had been on alert. He had no sense that this would be the day when 288 American aircraft would attack the Yamato in a coordinated assault that would last approximately 2 hours and would transform the greatest battleship ever built into a sinking wreck. All he knew as he climbed the ladder to his gun turret was that American aircraft were reported in the area and the ship was going to general quarters. To understand what happened on April 7, 1945, it's necessary to understand what the Yamato represented to the Japanese Navy and to the Japanese people. The Yamato was 263 meters long and displaced 72,000 tons when fully loaded. It carried 9 460mm guns, the largest naval guns ever mounted on a ship. Each of these guns weighed 65 tons and could fire a shell that weighed over 1,400 kilograms, a distance of over 40 kilometers. No ship in the world had guns this large. No ship in the world had armor as thick as the Yamato's. No ship in the world was as formidable as the Yamato. The ship was completed in 1941 and immediately became a symbol of Japanese military power. It represented the pinnacle of Japanese engineering and Japanese naval capability. It represented the belief that Japan could build weapons that would give it strategic advantage over any potential enemy. From a technical standpoint, the Yamato was an impressive achievement. Japanese engineers had solved difficult problems of weight distribution, armor protection, and fire control systems. The ship represented years of research and development and enormous financial investment. But there was a fundamental problem with the Yamato. By the time the ship was completed in 1941, naval warfare was already being dominated by aircraft. The battleship had become obsolete. The future of naval combat belonged to aircraft carriers and aircraft, not to battleships and naval guns. The Japanese Navy had not fully accepted this reality. The Yamato was built as if battleship-to-battleship combat was still the primary form of naval warfare. The ship carried massive guns for long-range naval engagements, but it carried relatively light anti-aircraft armament for a ship of its size and importance. This made the Yamato vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack that would occur on April 7, 1945. Coordinated air attacks from multiple aircraft types attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. Throughout the war, the Yamato had been in relatively little combat. It had participated in a few naval engagements and had been damaged a few times, but it had never faced a full-scale air attack. Japanese sailors aboard the ship believed that if the Yamato ever faced such an attack, the ship's armor and firepower would allow it to survive and continue fighting. This belief would be tested on April 7, 1945. The Yamato was not patrolling aimlessly on April 7th. The ship was on a specific mission called Operation 10 Go, which was a desperate attempt by the Japanese Navy to strike a blow against American forces. The plan was for the Yamato, escorted by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, to sail south through the Ryukyu Islands and attack American landing craft that were supporting the invasion of Okinawa. The Yamato would use its massive guns to destroy American transports and support ships. It would inflict enough damage to disrupt American operations. It would demonstrate Japanese naval power and Japanese determination to continue fighting. It was a suicide mission, though this wasn't explicitly stated. The Yamato and its escort would face overwhelming air opposition. The American Air Force had complete air superiority in the region. Japanese aircraft were barely operational. There was no air cover available for the Yamato. The ship would have to face American aircraft alone, defended only by its own anti-aircraft guns. The Japanese Navy went ahead with the plan anyway. Perhaps they believed the Yamato could survive. Perhaps they knew it probably wouldn't, but felt obliged to commit the ship in one last dramatic gesture. Perhaps they simply had no other options left. By April 1945, the Japanese Navy had been so thoroughly defeated that it no longer had a choice between good options and bad options. It had only bad options and worse options. The Yamato sailed north from its base at Kure on the evening of April 6th. Takeshi was on watch when the ship got underway. He could feel the enormous power of the ship's engines as the Yamato began moving through the harbor and out into the inland sea. Around him, other sailors were going about their duties. Some were nervous, some were casual, some seemed not to fully understand the danger of what they were attempting. As the sun set on April 6th, the Yamato was committed. There would be no turning back. The ship would continue south throughout the night, and in the morning it would face the American Air Force. Takeshi tried to sleep, but couldn't. Too many thoughts were in his head. He was 22 years old. He had joined the Navy because it was a path to honor and adventure. He had been trained as a naval combatant, but he had no delusions about what was coming. He had seen American aircraft. He understood what American firepower could do. He understood that the Yamato was being sent on a mission that was probably suicidal. By dawn on April 7th, Takeshi had made peace with the situation. If this was his last day, then this was his last day. He would do his duty, he would fight the ship's anti-aircraft guns, and he would perform his responsibilities as a naval officer. And if the ship was sunk and he died, then that would be what would happen. He had no expectation of surviving April 7th. The first American aircraft were spotted at approximately 0830 hours on April 7th. A lookout shouted a warning. An officer reported the sighting to the bridge. The ship's air defense system swung into action. Takeshi was at his post in the gun turret when the general quarters alarm sounded. The crew began manning anti-aircraft guns. Officers began issuing orders. The entire ship became alert and ready for combat. The first American aircraft to appear were fighters, F-60F Hellcats, flying top cover for the attack formation that was coming behind them. These aircraft were fast, maneuverable, and deadly. They began making runs at the Yamato, diving to attack and then climbing away to avoid the ship's anti-aircraft fire. The Yamato's anti-aircraft defenses opened up with a roar. Machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons began firing. The noise was deafening. The concussions from the large guns shook the entire ship. Through a viewport in his gun turret, Takeshi could see tracer rounds streaking into the sky, trying to hit the American fighters. Some of the American fighters were hit. Takeshi saw smoke trail from one aircraft. He saw another fighter break apart in midair as anti-aircraft fire caught it. But most of the American fighters survived the anti-aircraft barrage. They made their attacks, firing their machine guns at the ship, and then climbed away to make another pass. This continued for several minutes. The American fighters were making runs on the ship, and the Yamato was defending itself with everything it had. Takeshi could feel the ship maneuvering, turning to avoid attacks, and to bring different anti-aircraft gun batteries to bear on new targets. At this point, Takeshi was still relatively calm. The Yamato was being attacked, yes, but the ship was defending itself effectively. American fighters had been hit. The ship's armor was protecting it from the machine gun fire of the fighters. The situation seemed manageable.
Then the dive bombers arrived. The American dive bombers, Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft, appeared at approximately 0900 hours. These aircraft were slower and less maneuverable than the fighters, but they carried bombs and they were trained to deliver those bombs with devastating accuracy. The dive bombers approached at high altitude and then peeled off into steep dives aimed directly at the Yamato. As they dove, anti-aircraft guns on the ship tried to track them. Tracers streaked into the sky. Shells exploded. But the dive bombers were committed to their attack runs, and many of them pressed through the anti-aircraft fire. Takeshi watched in his gun turret as the dive bombers released their bombs. The bombs came down like falling objects, growing larger as they approached. Takeshi braced himself, knowing that the explosions were coming. The first bomb hit the Yamato's superstructure. The explosion was massive. Takeshi felt the ship shudder. Smoke and debris rose into the air. Sailors screamed. The ship's communication systems crackled with reports of damage. More bombs fell. Another hit on the superstructure. Another explosion. The ship shuddered again. Takeshi's gun turret rocked with the concussions. He could smell smoke and burning material. The dive bombers continued their attacks for several more minutes. Bomb after bomb hit the ship. Some near misses detonated in the water next to the hull, creating tremendous shockwaves that shook the ship. Some direct hits scored on the deck and superstructure. By the time the dive bombers had completed their runs, the Yamato had been hit by multiple bombs. There were fires on the deck. Casualties had occurred. The ship had sustained damage, but it was still afloat. It was still fighting. The armor had protected the ship from the worst of the bomb damage. Takeshi, in his gun turret, was beginning to understand the scale of what was happening. This was not a small raid. This was not a few aircraft. There seemed to be an endless stream of American aircraft. And the worst part was still coming. The torpedo bombers, Grumman TB-4 Avengers, arrived at approximately 0930 hours. These aircraft carried aerial torpedoes instead of bombs. Torpedoes were far more dangerous to a battleship than bombs because torpedoes attacked the ship below the waterline. Torpedoes could puncture the hull and flood the ship's compartments. The Yamato had been designed with torpedo protection systems. The hull had been double-bottomed. There were watertight compartments. The ship was supposed to be able to survive multiple torpedo hits. This was one of the reasons why Japanese sailors believed the Yamato was unsinkable. But there were limits to how much torpedo damage any ship could take. The torpedo bombers attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Some came from one side of the ship, some came from the other side. Some attacked from the bow, some attacked from the stern. It was a coordinated, overwhelming assault. As the torpedo bombers made their runs, the Yamato's anti-aircraft guns tried desperately to shoot them down, but the Avengers were tough aircraft. They took a lot of punishment to bring down. Many of them pressed through the anti-aircraft fire and released their torpedoes. Takeshi heard the explosions as the torpedoes hit the ship. Unlike bomb explosions, which were sharp and sudden, torpedo explosions seemed to come from deep within the ship. The ship heaved and tilted. Alarms sounded. Officers shouted orders to damage control parties. One torpedo hit on the starboard side. The ship tilted. Water was flooding into the compartments below. Damage control teams scrambled to seal the flooded compartments and prevent the water from spreading. Another torpedo hit on the port side. The ship tilted even more. The angle of the ship was becoming pronounced. Takeshi could feel it in his gun turret. The deck beneath him was no longer level. More torpedoes hit. Each one added to the list. Each one flooded more compartments. Each one reduced the ship's ability to continue fighting. Takeshi understood what was happening. The Yamato was taking on water. The ship was beginning to sink. By 10 a.m. on April 7th, the situation aboard the Yamato was becoming desperate. The ship had taken approximately 7 torpedo hits and multiple bomb hits. The list had become so severe that compartments on one side of the ship were completely flooded. The ship was fighting against the physics of sinking. Officers were giving orders to counter the list. The ship was trying to manage the water flooding in and the air escaping and the list getting worse, but it was a losing battle. The water was coming in faster than damage control parties could handle it. Takeshi, in his gun turret, could see that the ship was in trouble. The deck beneath him was tilted at an angle that was becoming extreme. Other sailors were struggling to maintain their positions. Some were being thrown down by the list. The anti-aircraft guns were still firing, but the angle was making it harder to track American aircraft. American aircraft were still attacking. Wave after wave of Avengers were making runs at the Yamato, launching more torpedoes. The ship's anti-aircraft guns were still responding, trying to shoot down as many aircraft as possible, but there seemed to be an endless supply of American aircraft. Takeshi's diary entry from later that day, written after the Yamato had been abandoned and Takeshi had been picked up by a Japanese destroyer, describes what he was feeling. At approximately 10 a.m. on April 7th, I realized that the Yamato was dying. I had believed what I had been told about the ship being unsinkable. I had believed that the armor would protect it. I had believed that the anti-aircraft defenses would be sufficient. I had believed that the Japanese Navy would not send the Yamato on a suicide mission. I was wrong about all of these things. The ship was listing so badly that I could barely maintain my position in the gun turret. Water was flooding in through the hull. Compartments were being sealed, but more compartments were flooding faster than we could seal them. The ship was sinking, and the American aircraft kept coming, wave after wave, hundreds of them, maybe more than 1,000. I had never seen anything like it. The American air power was like a force of nature, like a storm or a tsunami or something sent by the gods. There was no way to stop it. There was no way to defend against it. There was only the reality that the American aircraft were destroying the Yamato.
By 1100 hours, the Yamato was listing so severely that officers were ordering personnel to evacuate the gun turrets and move to safer positions. The ship was no longer fighting effectively. The anti-aircraft guns were no longer operational. The ship was simply trying to stay afloat long enough for the crew to abandon ship. Takeshi climbed down from his gun turret for the last time. Around him, the ship was in chaos. Explosions continued, fires burned. Sailors were struggling to reach the deck where they might be able to jump into the water or board lifeboats. The ship's list had become so extreme that walking was nearly impossible. Takeshi had to climb along railings and structural members to make his way toward the deck. Other sailors were doing the same thing. All around him were scenes of devastation. When Takeshi reached the main deck, he saw the extent of the damage more clearly. The superstructure was twisted and burning. Sections of the deck were buckled and warped. There were bodies on the deck. Many sailors had been killed in the explosions and by flying debris. American aircraft were still making passes at the ship, still launching weapons at a ship that was clearly dying. It seemed almost pointless. The ship was sinking. There was no need to continue attacking. But the American aircraft continued, pressing home their attacks, ensuring that the Yamato would not survive. Officers were shouting orders, "Abandon ship." Sailors who could move were making their way to the railings and jumping into the water. Sailors who were injured or trapped were being helped by their shipmates or were being left behind. Takeshi jumped into the water at approximately 11:30 hours. The water was cold. There were hundreds of other sailors in the water, some swimming, some floating, some drowning. There were survivors from the Yamato and survivors from escort ships that had also been sunk. Takeshi, floating in the water, turned to look back at the Yamato. The massive ship, which had seemed invincible just hours earlier, was sinking rapidly. The bow was already underwater. The stern was rising into the air as the ship tilted and broke apart. The American aircraft, having completed their attack runs, were circling overhead, watching the ship sink. Some were heading back toward their carriers. Some were still attacking the Japanese escort ships that were still trying to flee. At approximately 11:50 hours, the Yamato rolled completely over and broke in half. The massive ship, the largest battleship ever built, the symbol of Japanese military power, disappeared beneath the surface of the ocean. Takeshi watched it happen. He watched the unsinkable Yamato sink. He watched it disappear completely beneath the waves. He watched the water close over the spot where the ship had been just moments before. It was over. The ship was gone. The crew was scattered in the water, waiting for rescue by Japanese destroyers that were fleeing the American aircraft. Takeshi, treading water, tried to process what he had seen. The ship that he had served on for 3 years. The ship that had seemed invincible. The ship that had represented Japanese military power. That ship was now at the bottom of the ocean, destroyed by American aircraft. The American air power had seemed godlike. It had seemed beyond human capacity. Hundreds of aircraft, coordinated, overwhelming, relentless. The American aircraft had destroyed the Yamato as if the massive battleship was nothing. As if centuries of battleship dominance meant nothing. As if the armor and the guns and all of the engineering meant nothing. Takeshi was rescued by the Japanese destroyer Hamikaze at approximately 1200 hours. He was one of 280 survivors picked up by the destroyers. The Yamato had a crew of approximately 2,400 sailors. Most of them died in the attack or in the sinking. The destroyers fled northward, trying to escape the American aircraft that were still operating in the area. By the time the destroyers reached safety, they had picked up survivors from the Yamato and the other escort ships. It was estimated that over 3,600 sailors had been killed in the operation. Takeshi was transferred to another ship several days later and eventually made his way back to Japan. He spent the rest of the war serving in various capacities. When the war ended in September 1945, Takeshi was alive. Many of his shipmates were not. In the years after the war, Takeshi kept detailed notes about his experiences. He wrote about what he had seen during the sinking of the Yamato. He wrote about what it meant. He wrote about the overwhelming power of American Air Force. In 1960, Takeshi gave an interview to a Japanese historian studying the Pacific War. He was asked to describe what he had witnessed on April 7, 1945. Takeshi's response was measured but clear. The American air power was like nothing I had ever imagined. I had been trained as a naval officer. I understood military power. I understood warships and weapon systems. I had seen American aircraft before, but what I witnessed on April 7th was something different. It was not merely military power. It was overwhelming superiority expressed through coordinated action. Hundreds of aircraft attacking simultaneously from multiple directions. Each aircraft doing its part, each attack wave coordinated with the previous wave. It was like watching a force of nature, like watching an avalanche or a tsunami or something sent by the gods to destroy us. The Yamato was the greatest battleship ever built. It represented the peak of Japanese naval engineering, but it meant nothing against American air power. The aircraft destroyed it as easily as you would crush an ant. There was no defense. There was no counter. There was only the reality that American air power was superior and Japanese naval power was obsolete. I have thought about this many times in the years since the war. The Yamato was not just a battleship. It was a symbol of Japanese power and Japanese confidence in our military capability. The destruction of the Yamato was also the destruction of that confidence. It showed that no matter how large or how well armored or how powerful your weapons are, they mean nothing if your enemy has superior technology and superior coordination. American air power on that day seemed godlike. It seemed beyond human capacity. It was the moment that I understood that Japan had already lost the war.
not strategically or politically, but militarily. We could not compete with American industrial capacity and American military organization.
The attack on the Yamato by 288 American aircraft resulted in the sinking of a battleship that had been considered one of the great achievements of Japanese engineering. The attack demonstrated something fundamental about naval warfare in the modern age. Battleships were no longer the dominant force. Aircraft were. The Yamato had carried 9 460mm guns. These were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship. They could strike targets at ranges over 40 kilometers. They represented enormous firepower concentrated in a single platform. But the Yamato could not fire on aircraft. The Yamato's anti-aircraft defenses, while impressive for their time, were inadequate against coordinated air attack. The Yamato could not move fast enough to evade determined attackers. The Yamato could not fight back effectively against an enemy that was fighting in 3 dimensions, rather than in the 2 dimensions of traditional naval warfare. The 288 American aircraft, by contrast, represented enormous flexibility. They could attack from multiple directions. They could coordinate their attacks. They could deliver their weapons with accuracy. They could adapt to the enemy's defenses. They could overwhelm any single defensive system through sheer numbers and coordination. The destruction of the Yamato by aircraft proved that naval power was no longer about the largest battleship. Naval power was about command of the air. Naval power was about the ability to project air power across great distances. Naval power was about coordinated attacks from multiple aircraft types approaching from multiple directions. This lesson would reshape naval warfare forever. After the Yamato sank on April 7, 1945, the battleship age was officially over. The aircraft carrier became the dominant vessel in naval warfare. And naval battles were fought between carriers whose pilots never saw each other directly. The Yamato, the greatest battleship ever built, became a symbol of the end of an era. What made the sinking of the Yamato particularly significant was not just the military facts. It was the symbolic meaning that it carried. The Yamato represented Japanese confidence in their military capability. The ship represented Japanese engineering excellence. The ship represented the belief that Japan could compete with any enemy in military technology and military capability. The destruction of the Yamato by 288 American aircraft carried a different message. Japan could not compete. American industrial capacity was so vast that it could produce hundreds of aircraft with the coordination and training to deliver a devastating attack. American military organization was so efficient that hundreds of aircraft could be brought together and coordinated to attack a single target. Japan could not do this. Japan could barely maintain its existing air force. Japan was losing pilots faster than it could train replacements. Japan was losing aircraft faster than it could produce replacements. Japan could not coordinate dozens of aircraft for complex operations, let alone coordinate hundreds. The destruction of the Yamato was in many ways the destruction of the last symbol of Japanese naval power. After the Yamato sank on April 7, 1945, the Japanese Navy essentially ceased to exist as a fighting force. There were still Japanese ships in existence, but they were no longer capable of conducting major operations. For Takeshi Yamamoto and for the other sailors who survived the sinking of the Yamato, the experience confirmed something that many of them already suspected. Japan had already lost the war. The military might not be ready to admit it. The government might not be ready to admit it, but the reality was clear. American military power, particularly American air power, was so vastly superior that Japan could not prevail. After the war, Takeshi kept his detailed notes about the sinking of the Yamato. These notes were eventually published in a Japanese journal focused on Pacific War history. The account became one of the most important primary source documents about the destruction of the Yamato. In his later years, Takeshi was interviewed multiple times by historians. He was asked to reflect on the meaning of what had happened on April 7, 1945. He was asked to assess the capabilities of the American military. He was asked to consider the question of why Japan had lost the war. Takeshi's responses were consistent across all of these interviews. He emphasized the overwhelming nature of American air power. He described the coordination and professionalism of American pilots and American military organization. He discussed the inadequacy of Japanese defenses against coordinated air attack. He reflected on the futility of sending the Yamato on what was essentially a suicide mission. In a 1975 interview, Takeshi offered this assessment. The Yamato was the greatest battleship ever built. It represented the best of what Japanese engineering could create. But it was built for a war that no longer existed. By 1945, naval warfare was not about battleships fighting other battleships. It was about aircraft fighting from carriers that might be hundreds of kilometers apart. The Japanese Navy did not understand this. The Navy still believed in the power of the battleship. The Navy still believed that the Yamato represented overwhelming military power. But the American Navy understood that air power was the future. The Americans built hundreds of aircraft and trained pilots to use them effectively. The Americans organized these aircraft into coordinated task forces that could strike anywhere in the Pacific. When 288 American aircraft attacked the Yamato, they were not just destroying a ship. They were demonstrating the complete obsolescence of the battleship age. They were showing that no amount of armor or firepower or size could overcome coordinated air attack. I watched the Yamato sink. I watched an invincible symbol become irrelevant in a few hours. That taught me more about the true nature of military power than anything I had ever learned in the Navy. Military power is not determined by the size of your individual weapons. Military power is determined by your ability to project power across distance, to coordinate that power with precision, and to adapt to the enemy's defenses. The sinking of the Yamato by 288 American aircraft on April 7, 1945, marked the effective end of the Japanese Navy as a significant military force. It also marked the definitive end of the battleship era in naval warfare. From that point forward, naval warfare would be dominated by aircraft carriers and air power. Battleships would continue to exist for a few more years, but they would be relegated to secondary roles. The primary naval power would belong to whoever could control the air. This was a revolutionary change in naval warfare. For centuries, naval power had meant the power of battleships. Empires had been built on the ability to project naval power through battleships. Military planners had organized their navies around the battleship as the centerpiece of naval warfare. The Yamato represented the pinnacle of this battleship-centered approach to naval warfare. It was the largest, most heavily armored, most heavily armed battleship ever built. It represented everything that conventional naval wisdom said about how to dominate the seas. And it was destroyed in a few hours by aircraft. The destruction of the Yamato proved that conventional naval wisdom was wrong. It proved that the future of naval power belonged to aircraft and aircraft carriers. The battleship age was over. For military planners and military strategists around the world, this lesson was profound. After April 7, 1945, no nation would invest significant resources in building new battleships. Instead, all of the resources would go into building aircraft carriers and developing air power. The battleship age had ended not with a lengthy transition or a gradual evolution, but with a single day when 288 American aircraft destroyed the greatest battleship ever built.
What made Takeshi Yamamoto's account particularly valuable was that it provided the human perspective on this historical event. Takeshi was not a historian analyzing events from a distance. Takeshi was a sailor aboard the ship, experiencing the attack in real time, watching the ship sink, struggling to survive in the water. His account captured not just the military facts, but the emotional reality of what it meant to watch the unsinkable become sinkable. It captured the shock of understanding that everything you believed about military power was wrong. It captured the horror of watching a massive warship with thousands of sailors aboard being destroyed by an enemy that seemed to come from another world. Takeshi's testimony also provided insight into Japanese military culture. He described the training that had taught him that the Yamato was invincible. He described the propaganda that had convinced sailors that Japanese military power was superior. He described the shock of discovering that this propaganda was false.
This perspective was valuable because it showed how the destruction of the Yamato affected not just the military situation, but the psychological situation. Japanese sailors who had believed in Japanese military superiority now had to confront the reality that they were fighting an enemy with vastly superior capabilities. This realization would have profound implications for Japanese morale in the final months of the war. If the greatest battleship ever built could be destroyed by aircraft, if the most powerful symbol of Japanese military power could be rendered obsolete in a few hours, then what hope was there for Japanese victory? The answer was, there was no hope. The war was already lost. The destruction of the Yamato confirmed what many Japanese military leaders already knew but had not been willing to admit. The Yamato sank at approximately 11:50 hours on April 7, 1945. The ship remained on the bottom of the ocean until 1985, when the wreck was finally discovered and surveyed. The Yamato had sunk in deep water, at a depth of over 300 meters. The wreck remained largely intact, preserved by the cold and deep water. When the wreck was examined in 1985, Japanese researchers and historians found evidence of the damage that had been inflicted by American aircraft. There were torpedo holes in the hull. There were bomb damage on the deck and superstructure. There were scars left by anti-aircraft fire from the Yamato's own guns. The examination of the wreck provided physical confirmation of what Takeshi and other survivors had reported. The Yamato had not been sunk by some mechanical failure or bad luck. The Yamato had been systematically destroyed by American aircraft operating with precision and coordination. The discovery and examination of the wreck gave a new generation the opportunity to understand what had happened on April 7, 1945. It confirmed the historical record. It provided new details about the attack. It demonstrated the overwhelming superiority of American air power. For Takeshi Yamamoto, the discovery of the wreck in 1985 was a bittersweet moment. The wreck represented the final resting place of over 2,000 of his shipmates. It represented the end of an era of naval warfare. It represented the triumph of American military power and the defeat of Japanese military power. Takeshi was 77 years old when the wreck of the Yamato was discovered. He was invited to participate in a ceremony honoring the sailors who had died in the sinking. He attended and gave a brief speech about what it meant to watch the Yamato sink and what it meant to survive when so many others did not. The Yamato was not just a ship, Takeshi said. It was a symbol of who we were as a nation and who we believed ourselves to be. The sinking of the Yamato was not just a military defeat. It was the end of an era. It was the end of a way of understanding military power and national power. American air power on April 7, 1945 was overwhelming and absolute. It was like a force sent by the gods. It showed us that our beliefs about military power were false. It showed us that industrial capacity and coordination mattered more than individual weapon systems or individual bravery. The sailors who died on the Yamato died as a result of decisions made by military leaders who did not understand this reality. They died on a ship that was sent on a suicide mission. They died because their nation could not face the reality of its military situation. I survived because of luck and circumstance, but every day of my life since April 7, 1945, I have carried the memory of those who did not survive. I have thought about what their deaths meant, and I have understood that sometimes the most important lesson that war teaches is not about courage or honor or national pride. Sometimes the most important lesson is about accepting reality, about understanding limits, and about valuing human life more than national pride. The sinking of the Yamato by American aircraft remains one of the most significant naval events of World War II. It marked the definitive end of the battleship era. It demonstrated the overwhelming power of coordinated air operations. It showed the vast gap between Japanese and American military capabilities. Takeshi Yamamoto, it marked a turning point in his understanding of what military power actually meant. It stripped away the propaganda and revealed the underlying reality. American industrial capacity and American military organization were vastly superior to Japanese capabilities. Japan could not win a war of attrition against America. Japan could not compete with American air power. Japan was fighting an enemy that had overwhelming superiority in every measurable category. This realization, shared by many Japanese military officers and sailors by April 1945, made the final months of the war a study of futility. The war continued, but everyone who understood the military situation knew that the outcome was predetermined. Japan would lose. The only question was, how many more people would die before that reality was officially acknowledged?
In the years following the war, Takeshi Yamamoto became a respected source for historians studying the Pacific War, and specifically the destruction of the Yamato. He was interviewed dozens of times. His account was published in military journals and history books. His perspective as a first-hand witness to one of the most important naval events of the war was invaluable. In a comprehensive interview conducted in 1982, when Takeshi was 79 years old, he was asked to reflect on the significance of April 7, 1945, from the perspective of nearly 4 decades. The sinking of the Yamato, Takeshi said, was the moment when the entire edifice of Japanese military confidence collapsed. We had been told that our ships were superior. We had been told that our engineering was superior. We had been told that our military strategy was sound. But in a few hours, on April 7th, all of that was proven false. What I witnessed that day was not just the destruction of a battleship. I witnessed the destruction of a way of thinking about military power. The Yamato represented everything that Japanese military tradition had taught us about naval warfare. It represented the belief that a battleship, if it was large enough and well-armored enough and well-armed enough, was invincible. The American aircraft proved that this belief was fundamentally wrong. The American aircraft showed that the battleship age had ended. The American aircraft showed that military power in the modern age is not about the size or armor or firepower of individual weapons. It is about coordination, communication, mass production, and the ability to project power across distance. The Yamato was the most heavily armored warship ever built. It had the most powerful naval guns ever mounted on a ship. It had armor that was designed to be impenetrable, and it was destroyed in a few hours by aircraft. This was not because the aircraft were superweapons or because they represented some revolutionary technology. It was because they represented a different approach to military warfare, an approach based on coordination and overwhelming numbers rather than on individual weapons platforms. The United States proved something fundamental on April 7, 1945. The United States proved that industrial capacity matters more than tactical brilliance. The United States proved that the ability to produce hundreds of aircraft and coordinate them for a complex operation is more important than building a single perfect weapon system. The United States proved that in modern warfare, organization and coordination are more important than individual performance. This lesson was painful for Japan to learn. It cost the lives of thousands of sailors. It sealed the fate of the Japanese Navy. It made clear that Japan could not win the war. But it was a lesson that needed to be learned. It was a lesson that the rest of the world has continued to learn over the decades since the war. When historians study World War II naval warfare, the Yamato inevitably appears as a central figure. The ship represents the apex of battleship design and battleship naval doctrine, but it also represents the obsolescence of that doctrine. The Yamato was built at enormous cost. The ship consumed resources that might have been devoted to other military purposes. The ship took years to construct. The ship required a massive crew and elaborate logistic support. The ship represented a massive investment in a weapons platform that by the time it was completed was already becoming obsolete. This was not the Japanese Navy's fault. No military in the world understood in the mid-1930s that the battleship would become obsolete. No military predicted that aircraft and aircraft carriers would replace battleships as the dominant naval power. The British Navy, the American Navy, and the German Navy all continued to invest in battleships well into the 1940s. But the difference was that the American Navy by 1941 was also investing heavily in aircraft carriers and aircraft. The American Navy was developing both capabilities simultaneously. When the Japanese Navy discovered that aircraft were more important than battleships, the American Navy already had hundreds of aircraft and was training pilots to use them effectively. The Yamato, when it appeared in 1941, was the greatest battleship ever built. But by 1944 and 1945, when the ship was finally committed to combat, it was already obsolete. The ship represented a way of thinking about naval warfare that had become irrelevant. The destruction of the Yamato made this clear to everyone. The ship could not defend itself against coordinated air attack. The ship's guns were useless against aircraft. The ship's armor protected it from nothing that mattered. The ship's massive firepower could do nothing to prevent its own destruction. This was the ultimate irony. The greatest battleship ever built, the most heavily armed and the most heavily armored warship in the world, was rendered completely helpless by aircraft. The Yamato, which was supposed to represent overwhelming military power, became a symbol of the obsolescence of battleship warfare. Takeshi Yamamoto died in 1995 at the age of 92. In his final years, he remained active as a historical consultant and speaker. He gave lectures to Japanese military schools about the lessons of World War II. He participated in documentaries about the Pacific War. He shared his memories and his perspective with anyone who wanted to learn. His message was consistent throughout his life. Japanese military leaders had failed to understand the changing nature of warfare. Japanese military doctrine had been based on outdated assumptions about naval power. Japanese military planning had not adequately assessed the industrial capacity of American military production. Japanese military strategy had not taken into account the psychological and organizational advantages that American military coordination provided. Most importantly, Takeshi emphasized that Japan had not lost the war because Japanese soldiers lacked courage, or Japanese pilots lacked skill, or Japanese engineers lacked capability. Japan had lost the war because Japan was fighting an enemy with vastly superior resources and vastly superior military organization. In a final interview conducted in 1993, 2 years before his death, Takeshi reflected on what he wanted people to remember about April 7, 1945. I want people to understand that the Yamato was not destroyed because it was a bad ship or because the Japanese Navy was incompetent. The Yamato was destroyed because it represented an approach to military warfare that had become obsolete. The Yamato was destroyed because the American Navy understood that the future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft and aircraft carriers, not to battleships. What I witnessed on April 7, 1945, was not just a naval battle. I saw a vision of the future. I saw that military power would no longer be centered on individual weapons platforms, no matter how perfect those platforms were. I saw that military power would be centered on coordinated systems of weapons platforms working together under unified command and control. The Americans on April 7th were not defeating the Yamato because they had better ships or better sailors. They were defeating the Yamato because they had better organization, better coordination, better production capacity, and a better understanding of what modern warfare required. The lesson of the Yamato is that in warfare, just as in life, it is not enough to be the best individual performer. You must also be part of a well-organized system that can coordinate with other performers to achieve objectives that no individual performer could achieve alone. This is a lesson that Japan learned painfully and at tremendous cost on April 7, 1945.
It is a lesson that I have tried to share throughout my life. It is a lesson that I hope the world has learned and will not forget.
The sinking of the Yamato by American aircraft on April 7, 1945, established a pattern that would define naval warfare for the next 8 decades. The battleship was no longer the dominant naval force. The aircraft carrier was. Naval battles were no longer fought between ships exchanging gunfire at visible ranges. Naval battles were fought between carrier aircraft that never saw each other directly. This represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of naval warfare. It represented the triumph of coordinated air power over individual ship performance. It represented the beginning of the age of air superiority as the determining factor in naval combat. For military strategists and military planners around the world, the destruction of the Yamato provided a clear message about what would matter in future warfare. It demonstrated that individual weapon systems, no matter how impressive they might be, could be defeated by coordinated systems of weapons platforms. It demonstrated that industrial capacity and production capability were more important than individual weapon performance. The lessons of the Yamato have remained relevant through the decades since the war. Modern naval warfare is dominated by aircraft carriers and carrier-based aircraft. The few battleships that remained operational after World War II were eventually decommissioned, and no new battleships have been built anywhere in the world since 1944. Instead, navies around the world invest in aircraft carriers and the aircraft that operate from them. They invest in coordinated systems of ships, aircraft, and electronic systems that can work together to project power across great distances. This is the legacy of April 7, 1945. This is what the destruction of the Yamato taught the world. In modern warfare, coordinated systems defeat individual weapons platforms, no matter how impressive those platforms might be. Industrial capacity and production capability determine military outcomes. Organization and coordination are more important than individual performance. In the decades after World War II, the Yamato became a symbol of both Japanese naval achievement and Japanese naval obsolescence. The ship represented the pinnacle of what battleship design could achieve. The ship also represented an end of an era. The sinking of the Yamato marked the final moment when a battleship could be described as the most powerful warship in the world. After April 7, 1945, that title would belong to aircraft carriers. For Takeshi Yamamoto, the memory of April 7, 1945 never faded. In his writings and interviews, he returned again and again to that day. He returned to the moment when he realized the Yamato was sinking. He returned to the image of the massive ship disappearing beneath the waves. He returned to the understanding that American air power was overwhelming and unstoppable. These memories were painful. They represented the deaths of thousands of his shipmates. They represented the failure of the Japanese military strategy. They represented the moment when Takeshi understood that Japan would lose the war. But Takeshi also came to see these memories as important historical testimony. His perspective, as a survivor of one of the most significant naval events of World War II, had value. His account could help others understand what had happened. His account could help explain the lessons that needed to be learned. In this way, Takeshi Yamamoto transformed his traumatic wartime experience into a contribution to historical knowledge and military understanding. He took the pain of surviving when so many others died, and he used it to educate future generations about the realities of modern warfare. When Takeshi died in 1995, his journals and his interview recordings became part of the historical record. Historians and military strategists continue to study his account of the sinking of the Yamato. His perspective continues to illuminate what happened on April 7, 1945. The Yamato rests on the bottom of the ocean, a monument to both Japanese achievement and Japanese defeat. The ship represents the last great battleship, the most powerful warship of its kind ever built.
but the ship also represents an end of an era, the obsolescence of a way of thinking about naval warfare. And in the memory of Takeshi Yamamoto, the ship represents something else: the human cost of military defeat, the pain of watching your nation lose, and the responsibility that survivors have to remember and to teach.